The moment Patrick Brooks rode into Caldwell, Kansas, on a sweltering afternoon in the summer of 1882, the dust rising in great amber clouds around the hooves of his roan stallion, he was not thinking about love. He was thinking about a dead man, and how he intended to make that dead man answer for what he had done. He had ridden 300 miles from Abilene with nothing but a canteen of water, a bedroll, a Winchester rifle, and a wound in his chest that had nothing to do with bullets. The wound was older than that. It had been carved into him 7 years ago by a man named Cyrus Graves, and it had never fully healed, and Patrick Brooks had decided somewhere between his 31st birthday and the morning he saddled up that it was time to close it for good. The town of Caldwell sat at the edge of the Cherokee Strip, right where the Kansas border pressed up against Indian territory, and it was the kind of place that wore its roughness like a badge. The main street was packed earth baked hard as iron, lined with false-fronted buildings that promised more permanence than they actually had. There was a saloon, a general store, a livery, a sheriff's office with a cracked window, and a handful of other establishments that catered to the cattle trade. Drovers passed through here on their way up from Texas, and with them came money, noise, and trouble in roughly equal measure. Patrick dismounted at the livery and handed off his horse to a wiry young man who smelled of hay and tobacco. He paid the boy 2 bits and walked out into the street with his hat pulled low, and his eyes moving the way they always moved in a new town carefully, cataloging exits and faces, and the particular quality of stillness that told him whether a place was dangerous or merely loud. Caldwell was both. He had a name in his pocket, written on a piece of paper in his own hand, Cyrus Graves. He had been asking about Cyrus Graves for nearly a year, following rumors and second-hand reports across 3 territories, and every trail had eventually pointed here. A man named Graves had homesteaded out past the creek, folks said, had himself a wife and a little land, had been quiet for some time. Patrick walked into the saloon, ordered a whiskey he did not particularly want, and asked the bartender, a heavy-armed man with a walrus mustache, whether he knew a rancher named Graves out east of town. The bartender set down the glass and gave Patrick a long, appraising look. "You a friend of his?" "Old acquaintance," Patrick said. The bartender wiped the bar with a cloth that had seen better days and said, without particular emotion, "Cyrus Graves has been dead 2 months now. Fever took him in April, left a wife and a daughter behind. The widow is still out on the property." Patrick stood very still. He turned the whiskey glass once in his fingers, feeling the cool smoothness of it, and felt the strange hollow sensation of a purpose that had just collapsed under him like a rotten floor. "Dead," he said. "Dead as a doornail," the bartender confirmed. "You want another drink?" Patrick stared at the amber liquid in his glass for a long moment. He had spent so much time imagining this confrontation, so many miles carrying the weight of it, that the simple fact of Cyrus Graves lying in the ground somewhere outside this dusty little town felt almost like a physical blow. He had been cheated out of something, though he could not say exactly what. Justice, perhaps, or something that had masqueraded as justice in his mind during all those long, sleepless nights on the trail. He drank the whiskey and walked out. He told himself he would ride on the next morning. There was nothing left for him here. The man was dead. The debt could not be collected. He would find somewhere else to be, somewhere farther west, maybe all the way to New Mexico territory where a man could lose himself in the Red Rock country and not be found for years. But something stopped him from leaving that same afternoon, and he was not entirely sure what it was. He found himself standing at the edge of town, looking out along the rutted road that led east toward the creek, and he could not make himself turn around. He told himself it was the horse being tired. He told himself it was the heat. He told himself a great many things, and none of them were entirely true. What was true was that he needed to understand. He needed to see the place where Cyrus Graves had lived and died, needed to look at the land the man had made for himself after everything he had done, needed to know whether the world had treated a man like that well or badly in the end. It was a foolish errand. Patrick Brooks was not normally a foolish man, but he had ridden 300 miles on a foolish errand already, so perhaps one more mile could not hurt. He retrieved his horse from the livery and rode east. The land out beyond the town limits was broad and surprisingly beautiful in the fierce way that Kansas land could be beautiful, flat and golden with late summer grass. The sky above it enormous and blue and alive with the kind of light that made everything look as though it had been recently scrubbed. There were cottonwoods along the creek bed, their silver-green leaves catching the breeze, and red-winged blackbirds calling from the cattails. A hawk turned slow circles high above the pasture. He found the Graves homestead after about a mile and a half. It was a modest place, a small wood frame house with a covered porch, a barn that needed painting, a kitchen garden behind a low fence, and a chicken yard. There were 2 horses in the pasture and a milk cow standing patiently in the shade of a willow. It looked, Patrick thought, like a place where ordinary decent life had been happening, and the contrast between that ordinary decency and everything he knew about Cyrus Graves sat sourly in his stomach. He reined up at the gate and sat his horse for a moment, not entirely sure what he intended to do now that he was here. That was when he saw her. She came around the side of the house carrying a wooden bucket, moving with the particular purposeful stride of a woman who had too much work to do and not enough hours to do it in. She was wearing a plain dark dress and a cotton apron, her dark hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed sun hat. She had the look of a woman in her late 20s, strong-shouldered and sun-browned, and there was something in her face that Patrick could see even from a distance, a kind of settled grief that had moved in and made itself comfortable without being invited. She saw him at the gate and stopped. They looked at each other across the distance of the yard, and Patrick had the strange, disorienting sensation of something shifting inside him without his permission. He removed his hat. "Afternoon, ma'am. I apologize for coming out here unannounced. My name is Patrick Brooks. I was looking for Cyrus Graves, but I was told in town that he passed in April. I'm sorry for your loss." The woman set down her bucket very carefully, as though it contained something fragile. She looked at him with dark eyes that were steady and measuring and not particularly warm. "Patrick Brooks," she said, and something moved across her face that he could not read. "I know that name." He went still. "My husband mentioned you," she said. "Once a long time ago, not kindly." Patrick held her gaze. "No," he said, "I don't suppose he would have." There was a silence between them that had weight and texture. A chicken pecked at the ground near her feet. The hawk was still circling overhead. "What were you going to do?" she asked. "When you got here, if he had been alive?" It was a direct question, and it deserved a direct answer, and Patrick found that he could not give her one. Not standing here in front of her, looking at the grief in her face, and the bucket she had set down so carefully, and the kitchen garden behind the fence. "I had not fully decided," he said, which was not entirely true but was the most honest thing he could manage right now. She studied him for another long moment. Then she picked up her bucket and said, in a voice that was neither warm nor cold but somewhere in between, "You can water your horse at the trough around back. Then you can go." It was entirely reasonable. He should have done exactly that, watered the horse, tipped his hat, and ridden away. And he would have, he told himself afterward. He fully intended to. But then the little girl appeared in the doorway of the house, a child of perhaps 4 or 5 with her mother's dark eyes and a rag doll clutched to her chest, and she called out, "Mama, who is that man?" And the woman named Bessie Graves looked at her daughter and then back at Patrick, and in her face he saw the full weight of what it meant to be alone out here with a child and a homestead and winter coming. And something in him that he had spent years carefully sealing shut cracked open without warning. "Just a traveler, Clara," Bessie said. "Go on back inside, sweetheart." The little girl disappeared. Patrick watered his horse. And then, instead of riding away, he found himself standing at the corner of the yard, hat in his hands, saying, "That fence post is about to give way. You'll lose the chickens." Bessie turned and looked at the fence post, which was indeed leaning at an angle that promised imminent collapse. She looked back at him with those steady dark eyes. "I know," she said. "I have not had time." "I could fix it," Patrick said, "if you have a post-hole digger." He could not entirely have explained why he said it. He was not the kind of man who lingered. He had not been, for a very long time. Bessie looked at him for a long, careful moment. "I do not know what kind of man you are, Patrick Brooks," she said, "and I knew what kind of man my husband was. Whatever your business with him was, it was not the business of a friend." "No," Patrick said, "it was not." "Then tell me why I should let you stay on my property." He met her gaze and said honestly, "You probably shouldn't, but the fence post is still going to fall." Something shifted in her expression. It was not a smile, not quite. It was more like the ghost of a smile that had considered appearing and then thought better of it. She set the bucket down again and said, "The post-hole digger is in the barn." He fixed the fence post. It took the better part of an hour, and by the time he was done his shirt was soaked through with sweat and his hands were blistered from the unaccustomed work. He had been a cattle drover, and then a drifter for long enough that honest farm work had gotten away from him. But the post was solid and the chicken yard was secure. Bessie brought him a tin cup of well water without being asked, and he drank it standing in the yard, and she stood a few feet away watching him with that measuring look. "What did Cyrus do to you?" she asked. The question hit him between the ribs like a flat stone. He turned the tin cup in his hands. "It was a long time ago," he said. 7 years. "That is not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It is not." He looked out at the pasture where the horses were grazing in the long light of the late afternoon. "We were cattle partners, Cyrus and I and another man named Eddie Lark. We drove cattle together for 2 seasons out of Texas. In the spring of 1875 there was money, a lot of money, for us payment from a buyer in Dodge City. Cyrus took it while Eddie and I were sleeping, all of it, rode off in the night. Eddie and I woke up broke and afoot in the middle of the Indian Territory. Eddie caught a fever a week later and died before we reached a settlement." He stopped. The memory of Eddie Lark was not a comfortable one, even after 7 years. Eddie had been 22 years old and had talked endlessly about a girl back in Missouri he intended to marry when he had enough money saved, and he had died in a shallow ravine in the middle of nowhere with that dream still unfinished. Bessie was very quiet. When he looked at her, there was something in her expression that he had not expected, not defensiveness, not anger, but a kind of hollow, resigned recognition. As though she was hearing something she had, on some level, already known. "I am sorry," she said quietly, "about your friend." "I did not come here looking for an apology," Patrick said. "I know," she said, "but I am giving you one anyway because whatever Cyrus did or did not deserve, Eddie Lark deserved better." She said it plainly, without flinching, and Patrick realized that she was a woman who had long since stopped making excuses for her husband, which was its own kind of sadness. He handed back the tin cup. The sun was getting low, painting everything in shades of gold and copper. "I should go," he said. "You could stay for supper," Bessie said, and then looked as though she had surprised herself by saying it. He looked at her. She looked back. The hawk had finally stopped circling and disappeared somewhere to the south. "I would not want to put you to any trouble," he said. "It is just stew," she said, "and I have been making conversation with a 4-year-old and 2 horses for 2 months, so." She picked up her bucket and turned toward the house, and over her shoulder added, "You can wash up at the pump." Patrick Brooks, who had ridden 300 miles to confront a dead man and had found himself fixing a chicken yard fence instead, washed up at the pump and went inside for supper. The interior of the house was small and neat, the kind of neatness that spoke of effort and habit rather than ease. There was a cast-iron stove and a table with 4 chairs, a braided rug on the plank floor, a shelf of books that surprised him, and a crayon drawing pinned to the wall that had clearly been made by Clara, 2 figures standing in a field, one tall and one small, under a very round yellow sun. The taller figure had a dark hat. Patrick did not let himself look at it for too long. Clara sat across from him at the table and regarded him with unblinking dark eyes. She had her mother's directness. "Are you a cowboy?" she asked. "I was," Patrick said. "Do you have a horse?" "I do. His name is Red. He is in your mother's pasture right now, eating better than he has in a week." Clara considered this information gravely. "I'm going to have a horse someday," she said. "Mama said maybe when I am 7. "That seems like a reasonable age," Patrick said. "I will be 5 in October," Clara informed him. "That is still 2 years." "2 years goes fast," Patrick said, and Bessie looked at him from the stove with something unreadable in her expression. The stew was good beef and root vegetables with cornbread on the side, and they ate in the easy way of people who have decided, for the time being, not to be enemies. Bessie asked him careful questions about the cattle trade, about the trail from Abilene, about what was happening in the world beyond Caldwell, and he answered them in kind. She had a quick mind, and she used it openly, without the coyness he had sometimes encountered in women who had been taught to pretend they were not as intelligent as they were. After Clara had been put to bed, they sat on the porch in the cooling dark, and Bessie told him, in a quiet, matter-of-fact voice, a little of what her life with Cyrus Graves had been. "He was not a violent man," she said. "I want to be clear about that. He was not unkind to me or to Clara. But he was dishonest in ways that I only fully understood gradually over years. I grew up believing that honesty was the foundation of a marriage, and I found out it was not the foundation of mine." She was looking out at the dark pasture as she spoke, her hands folded in her lap. "I have been grieving him since long before he died." Patrick said nothing for a moment. A coyote called somewhere out across the flat land, and another one answered from further away. "That is a particular kind of hard," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "it is." He slept in the barn that night on clean hay, and lay awake for a long time listening to Red breathe in the neighboring stall, and trying to make sense of the fact that he felt, for the first time in a great long while, as though he were somewhere he might want to be. He told himself that was the stew talking. He told himself that in the morning he would ride on. In the morning he did not ride on. It was not a decision he made so much as a thing that simply did not happen. He was up before dawn and feeding the horses and the cow, because he had been raised on a farm in Ohio before the war came and took his father and scattered the family like seeds in a high wind, and farm chores were in his hands and his body before he was ever fully awake. Bessie came out to find the animals fed, the milk done, and Patrick crouching beside the barn examining a wheel on the wagon that had a cracked spoke. She stood in the pale early light with a shawl around her shoulders and looked at him with that measuring look. "You are still here," she said. "The wheel spoke is cracked," he said. "I thought I could carve a new one if you have a proper piece of straight-grained hickory in the barn." She was quiet for a moment. "There are some boards at the back," she said, "left over from when Cyrus built the barn." He found the boards and set to work. Bessie went inside and came back with 2 cups of coffee. She set one beside him on the tailgate of the wagon without comment and went about her morning work, and they moved around each other in the yard with a kind of unconscious ease that neither of them remarked upon, though both of them noticed it. Clara appeared mid-morning and attached herself to Patrick with the complete unself-consciousness of small children, following him around and asking a continuous stream of questions about everything from the horses to how wood was cut to what cowboys ate on the trail, and whether they got lonely. Patrick answered each question seriously, because Clara was clearly the kind of person who deserved serious answers, and Bessie watched from a distance with an expression on her face that she would not have been able to name. He stayed 3 days. On the second day he fixed the roof of the chicken coop, where a board had rotted and let in weather. On the third day he plowed under a section of the kitchen garden that Bessie wanted to expand for the fall planting, and afterward they sat on the porch steps in the late afternoon sun, and Bessie brought out a jar of cold lemonade, and they talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with Cyrus Graves or old debts or scores to settle. They talked about books. She had been reading Charles Dickens and wanted to know if Patrick had ever read him, and Patrick had not but said he had read Mark Twain, and she said Twain was funny, but Dickens made her cry in a way that felt useful rather than sad. They talked about the land, and what it was like to grow up in Ohio versus growing up in Tennessee, which was where Bessie was from originally. And they talked about what the territory was like before the cattle trade had changed it. And the conversation moved the way good conversation moved, without effort, without performance, just two people who found each other genuinely interesting, discovering more and more reasons to keep talking. On the evening of the third day, Patrick saddled Red and said he would be riding out the next morning. Bessie said, "All right," and did not look at him while she said it, which was interesting. Clara, who was not burdened by the reserve that adults had developed over years of protecting themselves, said, "I do not want you to go." Patrick crouched down so he was at her level. "I will come back and visit," he said, which surprised him, since he had not planned to say it and had not thought until that moment that it was true. "Promise?" Clara asked. He looked at the child's serious face and then looked up at her mother, who was looking at something in the middle distance with studied neutrality. "I promise," he said. He rode into town the next morning and took a room at the boarding house because apparently he was not leaving yet. He needed time to think, he told himself. He needed to figure out what he was doing and where he was going next, and Caldwell was as good a place as any for that kind of thinking. He found some work at the livery, helping the owner break a young horse that had been giving him trouble, and he was good at it. He had always been good with horses, which were simpler and more honest than most people he had known. He spent a week in town, keeping busy and thinking, or trying to think, though his thoughts had a tendency to drift east in the direction of a modest homestead with a kitchen garden and a good porch and a woman who read Dickens. He rode out to the Graves property again after 8 days, ostensibly to check on the wagon wheel, which was a thin excuse, and he knew it. Bessie was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, and she looked up and said, "You came back," in a tone that was carefully neutral, though he thought he saw something in her eyes that was not neutral at all. "Told Clara I would," he said. "Clara is at Mrs. Haverson's place for the morning," Bessie said, "helping with the preserves," which meant it was just the two of them. Patrick dismounted and tied off Red at the post and walked to the garden fence and stood there looking at Bessie among her bean plants, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. The morning was warm and bright and smelled of turned earth and the sweet green fragrance of growing things. "I owe you an honest conversation," Patrick said. Bessie straightened up and pushed her hat back and looked at him. "All right," she said. "When I rode into Caldwell, I was not a good man," he said. "I mean, I was not a man with good intentions. I was carrying anger that had been sitting inside me for 7 years, and I had let it rot, and rotten anger makes a man into something less than he ought to be. I have been sitting here for the better part of 2 weeks trying to understand what happened to that anger, and the honest answer is that it went away somewhere around the time I fixed your chicken yard fence, and I do not entirely know what to do about that." Bessie was very still among the bean plants. "What are you saying?" she asked. "I am saying that I think I would like to know you better," Patrick said carefully, "if you are willing. And I am saying that I know the situation is unusual given everything, and I would understand completely if you told me to ride on and not come back." Bessie looked at him for a long time. A meadowlark sang somewhere nearby, bright and liquid. "My husband stole from you," she said. "Your friend died because of it, and now you are standing at my garden fence asking to court me." "I am aware of how that sounds," Patrick said. "It sounds complicated," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It does." She pulled off one of her work gloves and looked at her hand, and then put the glove back on and looked at him with that direct, clear gaze. "I have been alone for 2 months," she said slowly. "I was in many ways alone long before that. I have a child and a farm and a winter coming, and I am 28 years old, and I am not, I have decided, going to be afraid of complication." She paused. "But I am going to be honest with you, Patrick Brooks. I do not trust easily. I was not given good reason to." "I know," he said, "and I am not asking for trust. Not yet. I am asking for the chance to earn it." She looked at him steadily, and then something in her face settled into a kind of decision. "Sunday dinner," she said. If you want to come to Sunday dinner, you are welcome." He came to Sunday dinner, and the Sunday after that, and the one after that. By October, the pattern had become something that the town of Caldwell had noticed and formed opinions about, which was inevitable in a place that size. There were people who thought it was a fine thing. Mrs. Haverson, who ran the boarding house and had an affectionate, practical heart, said it was high time Bessie had someone looking after her, and that the man seemed solid, which was the highest compliment Mrs. Haverson gave. There were people who were not so charitable. A man at the saloon told Patrick directly that it was peculiar, chasing after a widow woman whose husband he had come to settle with, and Patrick looked at the man for a moment, and then said, quietly, that he had not come to settle with anyone anymore, and walked away, which was much more restrained than his younger self would have managed. The weather turned in October. The first norther came screaming down from the plains and dropped the temperature 40 degrees in 2 days, and Patrick rode out to the Graves homestead to help Bessie bank the house and seal up the barn, because the winter was long and cold on the Kansas prairie, and a woman alone with a small child and livestock needed more hands than she had. They worked side by side all day in the cold wind and built a good solid stack of firewood under the porch overhang and patched a gap in the barn wall. And at the end of the day, when the light was fading and the cold had teeth in it, they stood together in the barn doorway, and Bessie pulled her coat tighter and said, "I am glad you came today." "Me too," Patrick said. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the space between them felt very small, though neither of them crossed it. That Sunday, after dinner, Clara fell asleep on the braided rug in the corner with her rag doll, exhausted from a morning of running in the wind, and Bessie and Patrick sat at the table with their coffee going cold between them, talking in low voices so as not to wake her. At some point the talking stopped, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the silence had become something warm and comfortable rather than empty, and Bessie had her hands wrapped around her cup, and Patrick was looking at her across the table with something that he was no longer trying to disguise or qualify. "Patrick," she said softly. "I know," he said. "I'm not sure what we are doing," she said. "I think we are falling in love," he said, and the words felt strange and exact and entirely true. "And I know the timing is what it is, and I know you need more time, and I am not going anywhere." Bessie looked at him with those dark, steady eyes, and he saw in them the war between caution and something warmer, braver, more frightening. "I have been afraid," she said quietly, "of trusting the wrong person again." "I know," he said again, "and all I can tell you is that I have been many things in my life that I am not proud of, but I have never been dishonest, not once, not even when honesty cost me something." She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, just briefly, just for a moment, and it felt like something being decided. November arrived, and with it the deep prairie cold, and Patrick's arrangement at the livery had given way to something more permanent when old Jim Holbrook, who owned the livery, offered him a real wage in a small room attached to the back of the stable. Patrick had some money saved from the cattle years, enough to be of use, though not enough to buy land outright, and he was thinking, for the first time in a long time, about what it might mean to put down roots somewhere. The idea of it did not terrify him the way it would have 6 months ago. The idea of it, when he let himself think about what it might look like, had Bessie Graves in it almost every time. He bought Clara a small painted rocking horse from the general store for her birthday in October. It was a modest thing, hand-painted red and white, and Clara's reaction upon seeing it was so extreme in its delight that Bessie had to turn away and busy herself with something at the stove so that Patrick would not see her eyes. He saw anyway. He did not comment on it because he understood. There was a day in November, a cold, clear day with the sky the deep, impossible blue that only appeared in winter, when Patrick was driving Bessie and Clara into town for supplies. They were in the wagon, Clara bundled between them in her coat and wool hat, and she fell asleep against Patrick's arm somewhere between the homestead and the main road, and Bessie looked at her sleeping daughter and then at Patrick's face, and the expression in her eyes was one he had not seen there before, open and unguarded and full of something he could only call tenderness. "She trusts you completely," Bessie said softly. "She is easy to be good for," Patrick said. "Not everyone manages it." They looked at each other over the sleeping child's head, and Patrick thought that if he had ever in his life been given a clearer picture of what he wanted, he could not remember it. The crisis, when it came, arrived in the form of a man named Roy Deacon. Deacon was a lawyer of the predatory variety that flourished in the territories, a man who appeared respectable and used paper and ink the way other men used guns. He had been handling the legal affairs of a cattle baron out of Texas named Whitlow, and Whitlow had decided that the stretch of land along the creek east of Caldwell, which included the Graves homestead, was exactly where he wanted to run his expansion, and Deacon had arrived in town in late November with a leather satchel full of documents and a smooth, confident manner. He came to the homestead on a Tuesday morning when Patrick happened to be there, having ridden out to repair a section of pasture fence. Deacon arrived in a hired buggy, dressed in a dark suit that was far too elegant for Kansas in November, and introduced himself to Bessie on the porch with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He had, he said, some important information for her regarding the title to the property. It appeared that there had been certain irregularities in her husband's original claim, and it further appeared that a significant debt, gambling debts, he said delicately, had been recorded against the property in Wichita before Cyrus Graves had come to Caldwell. Deacon spread papers on the kitchen table and explained in measured tones that the debt was now held by his client, Mr. Whitlow, and that unless Mrs. Graves could satisfy the debt within 60 days, the property would revert to Mr. Whitlow's holding. Patrick stood in the doorway and listened. He watched Bessie's face as she looked at the papers, the way she went very still, the way she held herself upright even as the color drained from her cheeks, the way she read the documents with those steady dark eyes and did not let Deacon see her fear. When Deacon was done, she said calmly, "How much is the debt?" Deacon named a figure that was just large enough to be ruinous for a widow woman with a small farm and no savings to speak of. Bessie said she would need time to review the documents, and Deacon said of course, 60 days, and gathered his satchel with the satisfaction of a man who considers the matter already concluded, and left. Patrick closed the door behind him and turned to Bessie. She was standing at the kitchen table with the papers spread in front of her, and she pressed both hands flat on the table and took a long, slow breath. "He is going to take the farm," she said, not as a question. "Not if we can help it," Patrick said. She looked at him. "Patrick, I do not have." "I know," he said. "Let me look at these papers." He was not a lawyer, but he had spent enough time in the territories to know the basics of land law, and he had dealt with his share of men who used legal paper the way Deacon did. He sat down at the table and read every document carefully while Bessie stood at the window and Clara played on the rug with her rocking horse. What he found, after 40 minutes of careful reading, was that several of the documents bore signatures that were inconsistent with the others, the pen pressure different, the letter form slightly off in a way that suggested copying rather than original writing. "These are not right," he said. Bessie came to the table and leaned over his shoulder. He pointed out the inconsistencies. She looked at them for a long time. "You think they are forged?" "I think some of them are, yes," he said. "And I think a proper lawyer who knew what to look for would agree. Is there a judge in Wichita you could petition?" "There is a circuit court in Wichita," she said, "but I do not have money for a lawyer there." "I have some money put aside," Patrick said. Bessie straightened up and looked at him. "No," she said firmly. "I will not take your money." "It is not charity," Patrick said. "It is—" He stopped, started again. "Bessie, I am going to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer me directly because that seems to be the only way either of us knows how to talk to each other." She looked at him steadily. "All right." He met her eyes and said simply, "I am in love with you. I have been for some time. I am not asking you for anything except to let me help you, the way I would help someone I loved, because that is what you are to me. And if you tell me you do not feel the same, I will respect that and step back. But I would like to know where we stand before I watch a man like Deacon walk off with your home." The silence in the kitchen had a quality like held breath. Clara was making small sounds over her rocking horse in the corner. The stove crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the bare cottonwoods along the creek. Bessie looked at him for a long, long moment. Then she said very quietly, "I am in love with you too, Patrick Brooks. I have been trying not to be, and I have been failing at it for weeks." He stood up from the table. She did not step back. He put his hands on either side of her face. Gently, the way you handled something you did not want to break, and kissed her. And she put her hands against his chest and kissed him back. And it was the kind of moment that felt like something closing and something opening at the same time. Clara said, "Mama, why is Patrick kissing your face?" And they both laughed, and the laughter broke the solemnity of the moment and replaced it with something warmer and more alive. They rode to Wichita the following week, Patrick and Bessie together, with Clara in the care of Mrs. Haverson, who was delighted to have her. The trip took 2 days, and they stayed at a respectable inn, in separate rooms, and Bessie spent the evenings reviewing the documents again while Patrick talked through the strategy. They found a lawyer in Wichita named Arthur Kane, who was the kind of man who wore reading spectacles on the end of his nose and had a talent for finding the small, essential flaw in dishonest paperwork. He looked at Deacon's documents for 2 hours and then looked up at them over the spectacles and said that 3 of the documents were almost certainly forgeries, the signatures bearing clear evidence of tracing, and that furthermore the recorded debt itself was improperly filed under Kansas statute because it predated the territorial registration of the property by 6 days, which made its standing legally questionable at minimum. Kane agreed to represent Bessie at a hearing before the circuit judge, and Patrick paid his retainer, which Bessie accepted this time with a look on her face that was grateful and determined in equal measure. She caught Patrick's hand as they walked out of the lawyer's office onto the cold Wichita street and squeezed it once briefly, firmly, without saying anything, and he understood everything she meant by it. The hearing happened in December, in the Wichita courthouse, in a high-ceilinged room that smelled of wood smoke and old paper. Roy Deacon appeared with his leather satchel and his confident manner, and his client Whitlow, a heavy man who sat in the back of the courtroom, radiating the particular sullen entitlement of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through money and intimidation. The circuit judge was a man named Judge Mercer, who had the angular face of a hawk and eyes that missed nothing. He read the documents himself, asked pointed questions of both sides, examined the signature inconsistencies that Kane identified, and listened to Deacon's explanations with visible skepticism. After 2 hours of arguments, Judge Mercer ruled that 3 of the documents were inadmissible due to evidence of tampering, that the remaining debt documentation was improperly registered under Kansas territorial statute, and that the claim against the Graves property was without legal foundation. He looked at Deacon as he said it with an expression that suggested he had a very clear opinion of men who brought forged paperwork into his courtroom. Whitlow walked out without speaking. Deacon packed his satchel and followed, and as he passed Patrick in the corridor he said in a low voice, "This is not finished." Patrick looked at him without blinking and said, equally low, "Yes, it is." And something in his eyes apparently convinced Deacon that it was, because that was the last anyone in Caldwell heard of Roy Deacon or Whitlow's expansion plans. They drove back to Caldwell in the wagon through a light fall of snow, the landscape going white and soft around them, and Bessie sat beside him on the seat bundled in her coat and wool scarf and said very little for the first hour, which he understood was her way of processing. He drove and let her be quiet. After a while she said, "Patrick." "Yes," he said, "I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." She looked straight ahead at the snow-dusted road and the horse's breath making clouds in the cold air. Do you think you could be happy here, in Caldwell, on that land? He thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved to be thought about. He thought about the morning light on the pasture, and the way the kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and the sound of Clara's voice asking questions with the absolute faith that they would be answered. He thought about Bessie in the kitchen garden with her hat pushed back and her dark eyes steady and clear, and the weight and texture of the conversation they had had that went on for 2 hours without either of them noticing the time. "Yes," he said, "I could." She turned and looked at him then. The snow fell lightly around them, dusting the horses' manes. "Then I am asking you to stay," she said simply. "Not as a visitor, not just to help with fences and wagons. I am asking you to build a life here if that is what you want." "It is what I want," he said. "And I want to do it properly, Bessie. I want to ask you to marry me properly, not in a wagon in a snowstorm, but you can ask me now," she said. "I am right here." He pulled the horses to a stop in the middle of the snow-covered road. He turned on the seat to face her and took both her hands in his, her small, cold hands inside his larger ones. "Bessie Graves," he said, and his voice was low and serious and absolutely certain. "Will you marry me?" She looked at him with those dark eyes that he had come to know as well as his own hands, eyes that were honest and careful and in this moment, lit from somewhere inside with something that made his chest ache. "Yes," she said, "I will." He leaned forward and kissed her in the falling snow, with the horses standing patiently and the white Kansas plain spread out around them in every direction, and it was nothing like a story and exactly like one at the same time. They were married in February of 1883 in the small white church on the edge of Caldwell, on a morning when the temperature was bitter but the sky was a brilliant, unclouded blue. Mrs. Haverson wept openly and called it the nicest thing she had seen in years. Clara, wearing a white dress with a blue sash that Bessie had made for her, served as flower girl with great seriousness, carrying a small basket of dried wildflowers and dropping them in precise, deliberate handfuls along the aisle. The minister was a young man named Reverend Aldous, who clearly meant every word he said, and when he joined their hands and read the vows, Patrick felt the words land in him with a weight and a permanence that he had never anticipated and did not resist. Bessie's voice was clear and steady when she said her vows. Patrick's was quieter but no less sure. When it was done and he kissed her under the watching eyes of Caldwell's assembled citizens, Clara pressed in between them and grabbed both their hands, and there was a small moment of laughter that was not irreverent but was deeply, genuinely happy. After the wedding, things moved with the particular rhythm of shared life, the kind of rhythm that feels unremarkable from inside it but that is, in fact, the substance of everything. Patrick had sold his room at the livery and moved into the homestead, and together he and Bessie had talked through every practical detail of what building the farm into something more sustainable would require. He knew cattle and horses and the land. She knew the homestead and the soil and the particular requirements of the territory's seasons. They pooled their knowledge and their work and their small savings, and by spring they had expanded the pasture fence, added 2 more horses, and broken new ground on a larger section that would support a decent kitchen garden and eventually a proper crop. Patrick went back to work at the livery in the early months. They needed the income while the farm was getting established, but he kept his eye on the future, which now had a particular shape and direction it had not had before. He was thinking about the land east of their property that was still unclaimed, a good wide stretch of creek-bottom land that would support cattle. He was thinking about whether, in a year or 2, he might be able to file his own adjoining homestead claim and run a small herd. On a morning in late April, Bessie told him she was expecting. He was at the table eating breakfast and she told him quietly, with her hands folded in her lap and that measuring look in her eyes that always meant she was watching to see how he would receive something. He set down his fork and looked at her and said, "A baby." "In October," she said, "I think." He got up from the table and came around to her and put his arms around her from behind, pressing his face against the side of her neck, and said, "Bessie," in a voice that was quieter and more full of feeling than he had expected. And she put her hands over his arms, and they stayed like that for a long moment in the early morning kitchen, while the coffee pot steamed on the stove and the birds outside were carrying on as though the day were nothing remarkable. Clara received the information about the coming baby with a mixture of intense interest and thoughtful concern. She spent several days asking searching questions about where exactly the baby was going to sleep and whether it would take her rocking horse and whether she would have to share her rag doll. Each of these concerns was addressed seriously. The baby would sleep in the small room that Patrick was currently converting from a storage space. The rocking horse was Clara's. The rag doll was and would remain absolutely Clara's. "But what will the baby play with?" Clara asked. "We will make it things," Patrick said. "The way your mother made your doll, and the way your grandmother made you things when you were little." Clara thought about this and then said with an air of decision, "I will share the rocking horse sometimes, but only sometimes." "That is very generous," Patrick said gravely. The summer of 1883 was a good one, hot and bright, with enough rain at the right times to make the kitchen garden the best Bessie had ever planted. The creek ran clear and full through July, and the pasture grass came in thick and green, and the 2 horses Patrick had bought in the spring rounded out to a small remuda that he was already planning to augment. He filed a homestead claim on the adjacent creek bottom land in June, working through the Caldwell land office, and the claim was approved without difficulty. The land was good and uncontested, and the paperwork was, unlike certain other paperwork that had come through that land office, entirely in order. He built a proper fence between the 2 claims and began, in a small way, to run cattle. He bought a starting herd of 12 cows and 1 good bull from a Texas drover who passed through in July, and the herd settled into the creek bottom pasture and began making itself at home. And Patrick walked the fence line every morning in the early light with coffee in his hand, and looked at his cattle in his pasture, and felt something he had not felt in so long he had forgotten its name. He felt like himself. The real version of himself, the one that had existed before the anger and the loss and the long drifting years had worn him down to something less. He thought about Eddie Lark sometimes. He thought about the 22-year-old who had talked about a girl in Missouri and died in a ravine in Indian Territory with his dream unfinished, and he felt that grief cleanly, without the poisonous addition of rage, which was a different and more honest kind of grief. He thought that Eddie would have been glad for him, because Eddie had been that kind of person. He had been generous in his living, which was the most anyone could say about a man who never got to be old. One evening in August, Patrick told Bessie about Eddie Lark. Not the bare facts he had given her at the beginning, but the full account who Eddie had been, what he had been like, the particular quality of his laugh and his ambition and his unfinished plans. Bessie listened with her full attention, the way she always listened when something mattered, and when he was done she said, "He sounds like someone who deserved to live a long life." "He did," Patrick said. "I am glad you told me about him," she said. "He should be remembered." Patrick looked at her in the lamplit kitchen and thought that she was, among many other things, exactly the right person to have said that. Bessie's mother, a strong-boned woman named Margaret who still lived in eastern Tennessee, and who had been corresponding with Bessie throughout the year with a mixture of concern and cautious approval, arrived in September by train from Nashville. She came to see her daughter through the birth of the baby, and to meet the man who had, from the sound of the letters, reorganized her daughter's life considerably. Margaret was direct in the way that Bessie was direct, and on her first evening at the homestead, she sat across the table from Patrick after supper and looked at him the way a woman looks at someone when she is deciding whether to trust him with something precious. She asked him where he was from and what he had done with his life and what his intentions were. He answered all of it honestly, including the parts that were not flattering, the drifting years, the anger, the purpose that had brought him here in the first place. When he was done, Margaret was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Bessie told me all of that already. She is not a woman who keeps things from the people who matter to her." She looked at him steadily. "She says you are a good man." "I am trying to be," Patrick said. "That is the right answer," Margaret said, and poured him more coffee, which he took to mean he had passed. The baby was born in October, just as Bessie had predicted, in a hard and honest labor that lasted through a night and into the following morning. Margaret and the town midwife, Mrs. Garrett, were with Bessie throughout, and Patrick spent the hours in the kitchen, trying not to be useless, keeping the fire going and the water hot and the coffee made. Clara slept through most of it on the settle by the fire, curled around her rag doll. When Mrs. Garrett called him in at dawn, he went in with his heart hammering and found Bessie exhausted and shining with effort, and holding a red-faced, absolutely furious newborn against her chest. "A boy," Mrs. Garrett said. Patrick sat on the edge of the bed, and Bessie looked at him with eyes that were tired beyond words and full of something that was not tired at all. She put the baby in his arms. He held the infant carefully, the way you held something very small and very important, and looked at the face of his son, the scrunched, angry, enormous-seeming face of a new person who had not yet decided whether he was glad to be here. "Henry," Bessie said. "I thought Henry, if you agree." "Henry," Patrick said. It settled into his chest like something fitting into a place that had been waiting for it. "Yes, Henry." Clara appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, hair loose, rag doll forgotten in the kitchen. She looked at the baby with huge eyes. "Is that him?" she whispered. "Come and meet your brother," Bessie said. Clara came and looked at Henry with the intense, assessing seriousness of a 5-year-old being introduced to something unprecedented. She reached out one small finger and touched his fist, and Henry's fingers, with the instinctive grip of all newborns, closed around hers. Clara gasped. "He is holding my hand," she whispered. "He is," Patrick said. Clara looked up at him with an expression of wonder and something very close to joy, and said, "I think I like him," with great deliberateness, as though this were a considered opinion and not an instant adoration. The winter of 1883 was the coldest in years, and the homestead was warmer for having 5 people in it, Bessie and Patrick and Clara and baby Henry and Margaret, who had decided to stay through the winter, ostensibly to help, and actually because she had found that she liked Caldwell and liked the company and was in no particular hurry to go back to Tennessee alone. She was useful in ways that were numerous and practical, and she and Patrick had established a rapport based on mutual directness and a shared appreciation of strong coffee. Henry grew with the robust determination of a healthy baby who had decided life was an acceptable proposition. He was a large, cheerful child who slept well and ate with enthusiasm, and watched the world from his cradle with the wide, curious eyes of someone making a careful study of his surroundings. Clara sang to him with absolute seriousness and informed him regularly about the properties of various objects, the nature of horses, and the rules of her game involving the braided rug. Henry listened to all of this with apparent interest. Patrick's cattle herd grew through the following spring. He bought additional stock and traded some work with a neighbor rancher named Haverson, who was old Jim Haverson's son, and had taken over the family's small operation east of town. They began to talk about running their cattle jointly on the shared Creek Bottom Range, which would give both operations more room and more efficiency. The arrangement suited them, and by the summer of 1884 they had a working partnership that was contributing to both homestead stability. On a Sunday afternoon in June, Patrick and Bessie were sitting on the porch in the long evening light, Henry sleeping in a basket between them, Clara in the yard performing an intricate game that involved her rocking horse, 3 sticks, and a system of rules she had invented herself. The cottonwoods along the creek were in full leaf, throwing long, cool shadows across the grass. A pair of mourning doves called back and forth from the trees. The air smelled of warm earth and the distant sweetness of the blooming prairie, and the sound of Clara's ongoing narration of her game floated across the yard in that bright, particular music of a child, entirely absorbed in her own world. Patrick reached over and took Bessie's hand where it rested on the arm of her chair. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his without looking away from Clara. "I have been thinking about something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "The land north of the creek property, the section that borders Haverson's upper pasture, it came open last week. The man who had the claim filed on it moved on to Colorado." He paused. "If we filed on it, added it to what we already have, we would have enough ground to run a proper operation. Not large, but proper, something that would carry through." Bessie turned and looked at him. "How much savings would it take?" "Most of what we have saved this year," he said. "It would be tight for a while." She looked at him steadily, doing the arithmetic in her head. He had come to know the particular focused look she got when she was calculating. "Could we do it without going into debt?" "I believe we could," he said. "Just." She was quiet for a moment. A barn swallow cut a swift arc across the evening sky. Then she said, "File on it." He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. "Patrick," she said. "Yes." "Are you happy?" He looked at her, and at the sleeping Henry in his basket, and at Clara in the yard with her rocking horse and her sticks and her elaborate invented game, and at the cottonwoods along the creek and the long gold light laying itself across the Kansas plain. He thought about the man who had ridden into Caldwell 2 years ago on a roan horse with nothing in him but old anger and a dead man's name on a piece of paper, and he thought about how completely that man had been replaced by someone he liked considerably better. "More than I knew how to be," he said. "More than I thought I had any right to be." Bessie looked at him for a long moment, and then she leaned across and pressed her lips briefly against his cheek, a small, private gesture that meant something that neither of them needed to put into words. Then she looked back out at Clara in the yard and said, with the calm satisfaction of a woman who has built something real and knows it, "Good." They filed on the northern section in July. The homestead expanded, and with it, the sense of something permanent being established on the Kansas land, not by people who had stumbled here by chance, but by people who had chosen it and kept choosing it, season by season, difficulty by difficulty, morning by morning. Margaret, who had now been staying through 2 winters, announced in the summer of 1884 that she intended to make the move to Caldwell permanent. There was nothing holding her in Tennessee, she said. The house there was rented, and the neighbor who had been looking after it was getting old. She liked Caldwell. She liked the people and the land and the particular quality of the light in the evenings. And she added, with the directness that had produced Bessie, she liked her grandchildren, and she was not prepared to see them grow up in letters. Patrick said he was glad and meant it. He built an addition onto the south side of the house that fall, a proper bedroom for Margaret, and a larger sitting room that the whole family could use in the evenings. And Margaret moved in with her boxes and her Tennessee quilts and her cast-iron skillet that she declared was superior to anything they had in Kansas. And the homestead rearranged itself to accommodate her presence with the ease of something that had been waiting for this all along. The autumn of 1884 brought a good harvest from the expanded garden, a successful cattle season, and the particular contentment of looking back at a hard year's work, and seeing that it had produced something solid and lasting. On a clear October evening with Clara's 6th birthday still warm in recent memory, they had celebrated with a cake and a new pair of proper riding boots, which Clara had put on and refused to remove for 3 days. Patrick sat on the porch in the cooling air and watched the sun go down over the flat prairie, and thought about the life that had assembled itself around him through a combination of grief and accident and something that he could only honestly call grace. He was 33 years old. He had a wife he loved more every day, with the particular deepening that came from shared work and shared difficulty, and the thousand small negotiations and kindnesses of real marriage. He had a daughter who was 6 years old and already capable of out-arguing most adults, a quality he privately found delightful. He had a son who was a year old and had recently decided that walking was more interesting than crawling, and was conducting his relationship with gravity as a series of bold experiments. He had land and cattle, and a horse he had raised from a young animal, and a barn that he had partly built himself, and a kitchen where the coffee was always strong and the table was always full. He thought about the piece of paper he had carried in his pocket, with the name written on it. He had burned it, not dramatically but practically, in the kitchen stove on the morning after he and Bessie had agreed to marry, feeding it into the fire without ceremony. It had seemed like the right way to end it, not with a gesture but with an action, something practical and complete. The man whose name it bore was in the ground, and whatever settling there had been to do had been settled not by confrontation, but by time and circumstance, and the unforeseeable fact of Bessie Graves standing in her yard with a bucket in her hand, and the sunlight on her face. He heard the screen door open behind him, and Bessie came out with 2 cups of coffee and settled into the chair beside him. She was wearing her shawl against the evening chill, and her dark hair was loose around her shoulders the way she wore it only at home, only in the evenings when the work was done and the children were in bed, and she was lovely in the October light in the unpretentious and completely effortless way that she was lovely. She handed him the coffee. He took it, and their fingers touched on the handle of the cup. "Quiet," she said. "Yes," he agreed. Inside, he could hear Margaret moving in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of her cleaning up after the evening meal. Upstairs, Henry was asleep, and Clara was probably pretending to be asleep while actually reading by the light that came in under the door, which was a habit she had developed and which Patrick had decided not to address since reading seemed like a harmless crime. "I was thinking," Bessie said, wrapping both hands around her cup. "About what?" "About the spring." She paused. "I want to plant fruit trees along the south fence line, apple trees if we can get the stock from Wichita. It would take a few years before they bore, but we will be here in a few years," Patrick said. "Yes," she said simply, "we will." He looked at her profile against the darkening sky, the clean, strong line of it, and said, "Then we will plant apple trees." She turned and looked at him and smiled, a full, real smile, the kind she gave rarely and that still, every time, did something to his chest that he had given up trying to describe. "Patrick," she said, "yes, I am glad you rode into Caldwell." He thought about the long road that had brought him here, the anger and the loss and the 300 miles, and the dead man's name in his pocket, and the chicken yard fence. He thought about all the ways it could have been different, all the turnings where he might have gone a different direction and arrived somewhere else entirely, alone, with his old score settled or unsettled, and the same hollow purpose pointing him toward the next thing. He thought about the hawks circling overhead that first day, turning slow, patient circles in the blue sky, and the meadowlark singing in the morning, and the particular way Bessie had picked up her bucket and set it down and looked at him across the yard with those steady dark eyes. "So am I," he said. They sat together on the porch in the cooling evening air, watching the last of the light leave the sky, and the first stars appeared above the prairie one by one, and the coyotes began to call in the distance, and the land settled into its dark, wide, breathing quiet. It was an ordinary evening and a remarkable one, as all such evenings are, the kind that are easy to overlook until you understand all at once that they are exactly what a life is made of. In the weeks that followed, the fall deepened toward winter with its usual bluntness, and the farm settled into the rhythms of the cold season. Patrick rode the fence lines each morning, checking for breaks where the cattle might wander, mending where he found weakness. Bessie put up the last of the garden's produce in jars that lined the cellar shelves in orderly rows, their contents glowing amber and deep red through the glass. Clara commenced an ambitious reading program that she had assigned herself, working her way through the shelf of books in the sitting room with the methodical determination she brought to everything. Henry, now walking with increasing confidence and decreasing accident, conducted his daily explorations of the house with the focused intensity of someone mapping new territory. On a Saturday in November, Patrick rode into town for supplies and ran into Bill Haverson outside the general store. Bill was a few years younger than Patrick, an easy-tempered man with a broad, honest face, and they had developed the particular friendship of men who worked neighboring land and respected each other's judgment. Bill asked how the winter cattle were doing, and Patrick said well, and they talked for a while about the prospects for the spring season and about a new bull that a rancher near Medicine Lodge had for sale at a fair price. Bill said, then, with a slightly careful air, "I heard from my cousin in Abilene. He says there is good land opening up in New Mexico territory if a man wanted to go west. Says the cattle opportunity is considerable." Patrick looked at him. "Are you thinking of going?" "No," Bill said. "I am too settled here. I was asking whether you were." Patrick thought about it for approximately 2 seconds. "No," he said. "I am settled here too." Bill nodded. "Good," he said, "because I need a neighbor who can actually ride and does not complain about the weather." Patrick laughed and went into the store for his supplies. He drove home in the wagon through the cold, clear afternoon, the supplies stowed in the bed, Red and his trail companion, a sorrel mare named Daisy that Bessie had bought in the spring, pulling together steadily. The homestead came into view as he rounded the last bend in the road, and he saw the smoke rising from the chimney and the yellow lamplight beginning to show in the window as the afternoon darkened, and Clara in the yard throwing sticks for the dog. There was a dog now, a brown and white cattle dog named Biscuit, who had shown up in the summer with a lame front leg, and stayed after Patrick had set the leg, and who had appointed himself the homestead's official manager of all important matters. And Henry on the porch with Bessie, bundled in his coat, pointing at something in the sky that had caught his attention. Patrick pulled the wagon up to the house, and Bessie looked up from the porch and smiled at him, and Henry shouted, "Pa!" with the enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting for this event and is enormously glad it has finally occurred, and Clara came running with the dog at her heels, and the evening arranged itself around him with the warm, complete, irreducible quality of belonging. They were all inside by the time full dark fell, the lamps lit, the stove going strong, Margaret producing the kind of supper that smelled so good it was practically unkind to the neighbors, though there were no neighbors close enough to be affected. Clara sat at the table working on a letter to a school friend. There was a proper school in Caldwell now, and Clara had opinions about it, while Henry sat in Patrick's lap and chewed on the corner of a piece of cornbread with the serene satisfaction of someone who has exactly what he wants. After supper, after the children were in bed and Margaret had retired to her room, Patrick and Bessie sat together in the sitting room with the lamp turned low and the fire burning down to coals. She was sewing, the way she often sewed in the evenings, mending or making something, and he was reading. He had gotten into the habit of reading in the evenings, partly because the books were there, and partly because Bessie had recommended Dickens with such conviction that he had eventually felt obligated to investigate, and had found, somewhat to his own surprise, that she was right. He looked up from the book at some point and found her watching him with a look on her face that was soft and full of warmth and entirely unguarded. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just looking at you." He set the book down and looked back at her, and the fire crackled and the wind pressed lightly against the windows, and the house was full of the sleeping sounds of their family. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "When I rode into Caldwell 2 years ago, I was the angriest, emptiest, most purposeless I had ever been in my life. I had been pointing myself at something for 7 years and it turned out to be nothing. There was nothing there to arrive at. And I thought that was the worst thing that could happen. Riding 300 miles to find out the thing you came for is already gone." He paused. "I was wrong. It was the best thing that could have happened. Because if Cyrus Graves had been alive, I would have done whatever I came to do or tried to, and then I would have ridden away again, and I would never have known that the thing I actually needed was right there on the other side of a chicken yard fence. He met her eyes. I have been given more than I deserved, Bessie. I know that, and I intend to spend the rest of my life being worthy of it. Bessie had set down her sewing. Her eyes were bright, and he knew her well enough to know that she was fighting the tears she never let herself cry easily. She got up from her chair and came to him, and he put his arm around her when she sat beside him, and she put her head against his shoulder and he held her, the way you held someone when the holding was its own entire language. "You have already been worthy of it," she said quietly, against his shoulder. "Many times over." Outside the windows, the Kansas night was enormous and cold and brilliant with stars, the same stars that had looked down on the territory before any of them were born and would go on looking long after. The cattle were settled in the pasture. The horses were in the barn. Biscuit was asleep on the porch with his nose on his paws. And inside the warm house, with the fire going down to red coals and the lamp burning low, Patrick Brooks held his wife and thought about what it meant to have arrived somewhere. Not the way he had arrived in Caldwell, with purpose and anger and a dead man's name in his pocket, but the other kind of arriving, the kind you did not plan and could not predict, the kind that came about through the accumulated small decisions of staying and working and caring and being honest, until one day you looked around and understood that you were exactly where you were supposed to be. The spring of 1885 came early and warm, and the apple trees Bessie had ordered from a nursery in Wichita arrived in March, 5 slender young trees, barely more than saplings, packed in damp burlap for the journey. Patrick and Bessie planted them together along the south fence line on a clear morning, while Clara watched with the philosophical interest of someone who understood that good things took time, and Henry helped by carrying a small trowel and putting it in holes that had already been filled in, which was his current understanding of farming. They stood back when the trees were in the ground, 5 small green presences in the brown Kansas earth, their roots set and their futures ahead of them, and Bessie put her hand in Patrick's. "A few years," she said. "We will be here," he said, and they were. The first apples came in the fall of 1887, modest and imperfect and deeply sweet, and Bessie made a pie from them and set it on the table for supper, and Margaret said it was the best apple pie she had ever eaten, which might have been sentiment but was probably true. Clara, who was 9 by then and increasingly capable of startling insight, said, "It tastes like a long time coming." Patrick looked at her with the particular affection he felt for her sharp and beautiful mind and said, "Yes, it does." Henry, who was nearly 4 and at the stage of development where food was evaluated primarily on its texture and relationship to other foods, ate his piece with concentration and then said, "More," which was also exactly right. Patrick Brooks had come to Caldwell, Kansas, on a sweltering day in the summer of 1882 looking for a man who was already dead, carrying anger and an old score he had intended to settle. He had found instead a woman who stopped him cold in the middle of a yard, with nothing more than steady dark eyes and a bucket of water, and the simple dignity of a person who did not flinch. He had found a daughter who asked him questions as though the answers mattered, and a son who shouted his name like a celebration, and a piece of Kansas land that he had helped to make into something that would outlast him, and a life that was ordinary in all the ways that mattered and extraordinary in all the ways that counted. The score he had carried for 7 years had dissolved not in the confrontation he had imagined, but in the slow, honest, daily labor of being present and worthy and loved. That was not the story he had thought he was riding toward, but it was the true one, and it was enough, and it was more, and it was everything.